Capitalists sometimes think they can refute Marx with one simple rebuttal. When Marx says the workers make the product, so they deserve the reward for selling the product, the anti-Marxist replies by saying the capitalists took the risk by creating the product or the company in the first place. So it's the capitalist who deserves the reward. So who's right? Does Marx have any way to respond to this objection? Is this a mic drop moment for capitalism? In this video, I'll answer that question. I'll explain how Marx does respond and how he could respond. Now, whether you agree with Marx or even if you hate him, this is crucial information. For if you're on his side, you should know how to respond to the risk objection that many capitalists think win them the argument. And if you're on the capitalist side, you should realize that winning the argument isn't quite as simple as just pointing out that capitalists take risks and then dropping the mic. Even if that argument is right in the end. Me, I'm simply on the side of truth. So what's the truth? Watch and find out. Let's start with a brief rundown of Marx's theory of profit. Profit, in the general sense, is the reward or benefit one gets from an activity. In the financial sense, it's simply revenues minus expenses. Money taken in minus money spent. After all, if I'm going to make money selling something, I'm probably going to have to spend money to have something to sell. So profit just is the money left over after everything I spend to bring my goods to market and sell them. Nothing revolutionary here, right? But here's where it gets interesting. Suppose I'm the owner of a sneaker factory. Let's say I sell a pair of sneakers for $100. Of course, I can't keep the whole $100 because I have to pay my workers. So what if I paid my workers the full $100? Obviously, there'd be no profit because I would have received $100 for selling the sneaker, but paid out $100 for making it. I would have only broken even. So the only way I can possibly make a profit is if I pay my workers less than the $100 I make for selling the sneaker, right? That's just basic economics. Now here's the crucial move Marx makes. The reason there's a sneaker that can be sold for $100 in the first place is because the workers made it. They produced an object worth $100, which means, according to Marx, that the workers put $100 worth of labor into the product, which means that they deserve $100 in return for the $100 worth of labor. Except if they got $100 in return, there would be exactly zero profit. Therefore, in order for profit to exist at all, the workers have to get less than what they deserve. The very existence of profit means that the owner of the factory has taken something from the workers. It has taken the value of the product beyond what is actually paid to the laborers, which is why Marx calls it surplus value. Now, this is a hugely powerful idea. It says that the bigger the profit, the less the workers get what they deserve. And notice this isn't an idea drawn from subjective or sentimental morality. Marx thinks it's an objective, scientific fact that the existence of capitalists in the existence of profit in the capitalist system means that the workers get less than what they put in. And so from this point of view, you can probably see why Marxists often call capitalists exploiters or parasites or thieves, living off, if not stealing, the hard work and the production of the workers, and without producing or creating any value themselves. Which might seem to justify the famous Marxist idea that one should just get rid of those parasitic capitalists, make the workers the owners, have them, quote, seize the means of production, and give the workers the reward they deserve. But before we go down that slippery slope, let's look at the foundation, economically speaking. And this is exactly where the capitalist risk argument comes in. From the capitalist point of view, the capitalist doesn't just sit back and do nothing but rip off the worker. Right? The capitalist does something hugely important, and that's take the risk of creating or running the enterprise. The capitalist has to raise or spend funds to get the business off the ground, and there is no guarantee that this venture will succeed. So there's a huge risk involved. Remember, the capitalist has to spend money to make money, which means spending money before making money. In order to have a shoe to sell, the capitalist might have to build a shoe factory and hire the workers to work in it for days or weeks or even months. This takes time and energy and money. And that must be spent before the capitalist even sees a dime from the sale of their first shoe. Worse, what if nobody ends up wanting to buy those sneakers because the celebrity you got to endorse them posted a bunch of offensive videos online, for example? There's a big risk in outlaying capital to get a business up and running. And you might say, the capitalist deserves the reward for taking that risk. Otherwise, why bother? All right, so one argument is that rewarding risk is necessary for getting economic production and therefore sales and therefore growth. And that also means taking that risk to create the company creates the very jobs that the workers have, right? Jobs for which workers receive a wage, So not only are the workers not ripped off in the capitalist view, they should be grateful for the work that they do have. So how does Marx respond? Interestingly, Marx doesn't say a ton about this. What he does say is mostly in the fairly obscure Chapter 6 of Theories of Surplus Value from the early 1860s, and frankly, it's incomplete. So I, Aristotle, being the equal opportunity philosopher that I am, will set out Marx's reply, but also add to it the kind of thing that Marx could say. Then we'll look at some possible replies that the capitalist could make. Okay, so suppose I smell a delicious apple pie cooling on my neighbor's windowsill. You know in the cartoons, when a pie smells so good that its aroma tendrils come waft towards you, and then they form a hand with fingers, and they lead you by the nose, all the way back to its yummy, gooey filling. Suppose that's happening. But wait, that's my neighbor's pie. My kindly little neighbor who watched my cat and didn't steal my Amazon packages when I was out of town. I must resist temptation and not steal her pie. Besides, my neighbor is a bit of a gossip, and if she caught me stealing her pie, she'd tell everyone, and I wouldn't be invited to our rocking neighborhood block party next week. So stealing that pie would be pretty risky. Still, that pie sure smells good. So I decided to take the risk and steal the pie. There I am, sitting on my living room couch, sweet baked apples and cinnamon smeared all over my face, when the doorbell rings. It's my neighbor. Is that my homemade apple pie smeared all over your face? She says. Uh-oh, better think quickly. Then I remember that I've read Marx's Critique of Profit, and I know how the capitalists reply. Eureka! Well, yes, it was your pie, neighbor dear, but you see, I took quite the risk by stealing your pie, which means I deserve the reward. The sweet, gooey reward. Now, Marx doesn't quite use this example, of course, but he does point out his underlying principle, that there's a difference between an incentive and a justification. The pie's aroma incentivizes me to take it. That doesn't mean I'm justified in taking it. A burglar might be incentivized to rob someone, but that doesn't mean they're justified in robbing someone. This is so no matter how risky something is. It's riskier to rob a bank than shoplift gum, but that doesn't justify a heist. It's risky to drive an e-scooter blindfolded, but that doesn't mean I deserve money for doing it. I mean, imagine if I just said, I just drove my car fast. That's pretty risky. Give me money. Therefore, just because the capitalist is incentivized to invest in the hopes of making a profit, and they're willing to take the risk, that doesn't automatically mean they're justified in making the reward or the profit. Now, a capitalist might respond, of course, risking something to steal something doesn't justify theft, right? Because the thief doesn't own what they steal, they're not entitled to it, regardless of any incentive or hope of reward. But the situation with the capitalist is different. The capitalist owns what they risk. It's their money or their factory, so they should own the return as well. But aha, Marx can now say, it's not then the risk that justifies the reward, it's the ownership that does, apparently. This is a totally different argument, which I'll come back to. But in the meantime, note that this opens the capitalist to a Marxist response. The capitalist shouldn't own the wealth in the first place because it's derived from stolen profits. Right? That is, the capitalist might be investing funds derived from the extraction of surplus labor. So Marx can argue it's the worker who should own the profit because they made the sneaker, which is why so many Marxists accuse capitalists of being thieves in the first place. But Marx isn't done with the risk argument, which he actually tries to turn on its head. Suppose I'm a worker in a factory making shoes, but the shoes end up not selling, and then the company goes out of business. There goes my job. So Marx imagines the worker saying that by working for you, Mr. Shoemaker, not a real name, it is in general, but not here, I'm taking a risk too. So don't I deserve to be rewarded for that risk and a share of the profits? That risk and profit doesn't seem to be built into my salary. I'm just paid for my time, not the risk of what might happen later. Therefore, the logic seems to suggest that if taking on the risk justifies the reward, the worker should get paid more than they are. Now, it's true that this would only mean that the worker and the owner might share the profits, rather than the worker getting all of them. But that is a lot more than the standard capitalist argument tends to concede. Well, what of the idea that the capitalist needs to outlay funds, or to create or buy an enterprise before production or sales? Now here the question becomes, where does this money come from? I mentioned already one part of Marx's critique. Suppose seed capital or startup funds derives from profits made in some earlier enterprise. Well, Marx can simply claim that those funds were ill-gotten, right? Because they were taken from the workers' fair share of that company per his previous argument. So the very fact of needing to fund a business cannot be taken as a justification for profit. But Marx also makes another point here regarding leveraging or using credit to finance an enterprise. Marx gives the example of a textile factory owner, so I'll stick with my shoemaker example. Thank you very much. Suppose I need to buy raw materials to make and sell sneakers, such as rubber or plastic for aglets, those little doohickeys on the end of your shoelaces. That means I have to find companies that will sell me those materials, as well as companies that will sell me the machines with which I can make sneakers. That might make it seem like I need to risk my cash to get my factory up and running. But Marx points out that I don't actually need to pay cash for those raw materials or for those machines. I can use a bill of exchange, which is basically an IOU. That is, I can pay for the raw materials, not with actual money, but with a note that says I'll pay you cash later, which I'll do after my factory is up and running and I've started selling shoes. But then that means I don't really need cash ahead of time after all. And that's even if the suppliers who sold me the rubber or the aglets or the sneaker machines do need cash before I have it, because they can always just cash in or sell that bill of exchange to a bank. And I can pay the bank later on after I've made my sales. This way, everybody, or almost everybody, wins, because I, as the factory owner, don't have to risk or even use my own money to start up my operation. After which, I can begin profiting, and then the suppliers and the banks can profit too, because at each point there is interest paid. After all, why would the bank bother to pay cash for the IOU or for the bill of exchange? Because there's a fee attached, i.e. interest. That means that in addition to having to repay the nominal or literal amount I borrowed, there's also a certain percentage on top of that that must get paid back in addition. Thus, the suppliers and the bankers receive a little extra for being willing to provide materials or cash up front, and I get a little extra when I get the profit from the shoes that I sell. But not everybody wins. Marx points this out because the profit comes out of the worker's end. Right? We saw before that if the shoe sells for $100 and the workers get paid $100, there's no profit. But now we see that the workers can't get paid $99 either, because $1 in profits won't be enough to cover interest payments to the bank. Maybe I'll need to pay my workers only $50 out of the $100 if I'm going to afford all my payments and have a little left over for myself and my kids, right? And maybe for that summer house on the beach I've been dreaming about. So now we see two dynamics at work. One is that because labor is a cost, there is an intrinsic rivalry between profits and workers under capitalism, an inverse relationship. The more I spend on labor, the less my profits. And the less I spend on labor, the greater my profits, assuming at least roughly equal productivity. And this is a huge part of why Marx sees capitalism as a system of class conflict between owners and workers. Capitalists are motivated by profit, which means they are intrinsically motivated to decrease their labor costs. If that means lowering salary, or laying people off, or acquiring machines to do more of the work so fewer people are needed, then that's what the smart capitalist is going to do. Workers, by contrast, are going to be motivated to try to increase their wages at the expense of profits. For example, by banding together in trade unions to demand higher wages, by threatening to quit en masse or striking. That is, if a greater percentage of the money the company makes isn't given to the workers. And it's very easy to see this as a zero-sum adversarial struggle. The second dynamic of the capitalist system is that borrowing and finance obscures rather than reveals the relationship between risk and reward. Capitalism doesn't necessarily need, or the capitalist doesn't need to risk their own money, as we saw, because basically they can borrow the funds to invest. But don't they have to pay that back? Right? Isn't that the risk, that the capitalist might lose the money and not be able to pay back what they've promised? Yes and no. You've likely noticed that many businesses have LLC after their name, which means limited liability corporation. The very idea of such a corporation is that it only has literally limited as opposed to unlimited liability. So if I start an LLC and it takes out loans against which I used to buy a shoe company, and it goes under and I can't buy back those loans, I can't be forced to sell my house to pay back those loans. This is because my liability is limited in certain ways. And because the corporation is a legal entity or even a legal person distinct from me, its debts aren't my personal debts. Moreover, businesses can often declare bankruptcy and avoid paying back loans in a way that legally is very different than, say, student loans taken out by human persons, which usually don't have the safety net that corporations have in this respect. But what that means is that corporations are often designed to insulate the capitalist from risk, right? That's the purpose of an LLC. So again, we see Marx is in a position to say that what seems to be a risk isn't really the risk it seems to be. But even if it is, that still doesn't justify profit, per the stealing the neighbor's pie example. But there's one more thing Marx says here. Imagine that I'm still the sneaker factory owner, and remember that I might need to buy rubber and plastic and a sneaker making machine from various other companies. Suppose now I said to those companies, look, I know you want to sell me that rubber for $10 because that's what it's worth. But also, look, if I pay that much for it, it's going to cut into my profit margins. Also, I might not end up making money off these sneakers, right? They might be endorsed by someone who likes to tweet offensively. So I'm taking a big risk here. So how about I buy that rubber for $5 instead of 10? Now, Marx points out that would be laughed at. Slightly more poetically, Marx writes that if something like that happened, the suppliers would likely respond by saying, and I quote, "Don't make a fool of yourself. Don't talk nonsense. What the devil do we care what you propose to do with our rubber and plastic? Burn them, hang them if you like, throw them to the dogs, but pay for them. The idea." You can almost imagine the harumph afterwards. But wait, there's more. Quote, "We're not going to make a present of our goods because you have to set up a factory and you magnify to yourself its risks and perilous chances. Give up shoe production or don't come into the market with such preposterous ideas." So Marx reasons, your suppliers would laugh you out of the building if you came in saying that the risk you take as an owner means they should give you their goods for less than they're worth. So then why should it be any different with the workers? If the capitalist needs to decrease wages to make a profit, that's not any different than paying the workers less than what they deserve for the labor they're selling to the capitalist. That is, it would be ridiculous to ask the sellers of rubber to receive less than the rubber is worth because the capitalist wants to make a profit. So it would be equally ridiculous to ask the sellers of labor to receive less than the labor is worth because the capitalist wants to make a profit. So at this point, Marx has done a pretty good job of undercutting the risk-based rebuttal to his argument that owners don't deserve the profits. That is, the idea that the capitalist deserves a reward for taking the risk is not nearly as strong a rebuttal as it might have seemed to be when we started. But there is another line of defense here that the capitalist can take. It's not the taking the risk per se that justifies the reward, as if the capitalist were simply a passive investor with no role other than funder or banker. Rather, it's arguing that the owner makes a more direct contribution to the product. Look, answers Aristotle, this challenger might say to me, your whole sneaker example is flawed from the start. You can't assume that the workers put $100 worth of value into a $100 pair of sneakers. What about marketers or advertisers who hype or promote the sneakers? What about the people who manage the factory or the workers? Heck, what about the people in HR and IT who are supporting the company's operations? And most importantly, what about John Nike or Lori Reebok, not real names, who had the great idea for the shoe factory in the first place? Ideas and innovations don't come from nowhere. And factory workers don't necessarily know how to organize or run a company, let alone come up with a brilliant idea for one. Besides, it's the capitalist with their vision that creates the job for the workers in the first place. So they deserve the lion's share of the profits. So this too is a great and important objection. A brief reply that Marx makes is that while he concedes that the workers wouldn't have work to do without the machines or raw materials that the capitalists own, he points out that those machines or materials would just rust or spoil without the workers to work them. So at best there's equal dependence here, not a one-sided dependence of jobbers and job creators. So, but more can be said for Marx's behalf. Marx was writing during the 19th century, right during the ascendancy of industrialization. His emphasis is on factory workers and production sites that turn raw materials into infrastructure, right, such as railroad tracks or cotton or rubber into consumer goods like sweaters or shoes. But there's no reason not to say that marketers and advertisers in the 21st century aren't also workers. All right, the same for IT guys or HR staff or middle management. These are all workers on the payroll, even if they work with information or human-facing services rather than physically producing material goods. Right? HR workers have a wage or a salary just like factory workers, and the sum total of all these labor costs can be apportioned to the selling price of the sneaker. So the idea that marketers contribute to the value of the sneaker is not really an objection to Marx, it's really just a nuance. Right? A reminder that factory workers are not the only workers who contribute to the end product's value. Still, the profit is what's left over after all the expenses have been paid, including the full range of workers and managers running operations. And so the question is still whether the owner or owners, not the workers, deserve that money. So the better objection to Marx here cites the active role of the owner. We're all used to the idea of the visionary CEO or entrepreneur, the one with the brilliant invention, the one who dared to change the world, or who could see the future of markets and possibilities not yet dreamed of. Surely that owner deserves the rewards for having the vision, right? And for creating the company or the product, right? For being the visionary, job creator, and product imaginer. Now, what's interesting about this objection is it seeks to justify the owner's share by pointing to their contribution to the labor. All right, but now think about that. Suppose you reason that a whole team of people was needed to bring a product to market, and that the way the wages or salaries should be allocated is based on that contribution. Thus, perhaps the factory workers who physically built the product should get a certain percentage, the IT or HR workers another percentage, right? The managers another percentage, right? And so on. Maybe you even want to subdivide based on individual effort or contribution, right? For example, maybe factory worker Jill did more to create the product than factory worker Jane, so Jill gets a bigger piece of the pie. Then, by following that reasoning, perhaps the inventor or the creator of the product should get a certain percentage too. All right, but be careful what you wish for here. By treating the creative idea as a portion of the labor along with the other portions, this suggests that reward should be proportional to its contribution, which would mean a fixed share of the whole for a delimited period of time, not arbitrary gains or profits in perpetuity. So to illustrate, suppose we say having the idea is worth 25%, and the factory work and labor is worth 75%. Then if sales go up, the total amount of money made would too, but the percentages wouldn't. But what actually happens? Workers don't necessarily make more money when sales increases, because workers aren't generally paid per unit or per sale, but per hour, right, or week or year. Workers are usually paid for their time, not their productivity. Yet when someone owns the company and they produce and sell more, they get proportionally richer even if wages don't rise. Moreover, suppose the owner who had the great creative idea is able to lay off workers and lower labor costs. That's not coming out of the owner's 25% that we're imagining. If anything, the owner will now have a greater share of the revenues, as a smaller labor force may mean smaller labor expenses, right? Which may mean greater profits, as we saw before. And this is not simply per week or per year or per anything, right? The owner has the rights to the company in perpetuity, forever. So all the money it makes forever can be claimed by the owner or owners. It has nothing to do with the percentage of the product that the idea for the product represents, but the simple fact of ownership. That ownership is the crux, not creative contribution, that which we can see by looking at a number of other examples. Right? One is that the creators of the products aren't the owners of the company at all, even if they are sometimes. Right? A company might have a whole research and development or R&D division where people dream up new ideas for products, but they're workers, not owners. Right? Other times, the owner isn't even the founder of the business. Suppose Jill Reebok has the brilliant idea for a sneaker and creates a company, and therefore she deserves the profits. Okay, but what about when her sons and daughters inherit the company? All right, they didn't create the company, but they will be just as legally entitled to the profits as the creator was. Right? Or what if Jill sells the company? The buyers will be just as entitled to the profits as Jill was. Creativity and entrepreneurialism are not necessary for being legally entitled to profits, because creators and entrepreneurs can transfer their companies or its assets, and the new owners are just as entitled as the founder was. Because all that matters legally is that they have the title or deed, i.e. the legal proof of ownership. The same goes for any invention. I can invent something, but if I sell the intellectual property, then it's the new owner who makes the money. It's ownership that counts in our world, not creation. And this is why, in the end, the real justification for deserving the wealth comes down to the idea that someone is entitled to the rewards that come from owning something. All right, from having a title of ownership and therefore being entitled to the wealth it generates. The fact that the company is mine means I get to use it how I want and take from it what I want. Of course, I might owe my suppliers or workers something if I've contracted or agreed with them to perform a service in exchange for a fee or a wage, but that's it. I don't owe them anything beyond that. When it's my property, my company, my stocks, my IP, that's mine. I own it, and as long as I didn't steal it, I'm entitled to whatever it reaps. Of course, that's why the Marxist is so keen to argue that the capitalists did steal it, at least in a sense, that the wealth, their funds, or capital were unjustly extracted from the workers, right? Or that it was built on a history of coerced and so unfree labor that was never really agreed to, or why property shouldn't even be held privately at all. So nobody can say that they and they alone deserve the fruits of owning something that nobody else owns. And that's also why, in turn, the capitalist is so keen to have a theory of property rights, often natural property rights. that would legitimate the claim to private ownership, or else appeal to a utilitarian argument, according to which society and the economy works better when it's based on a foundation of private property, because a rising tide lifts all ships. But which of these claims is right? Well, that will have to wait for another video. So tell me what you think in the comments. Are there arguments for the capitalist deserving the profit that I haven't covered here? Think you've got a great counter-argument to Marx? Let me know. And even if you don't own the means of production, you do own the means to click like and subscribe. See you next time, wisdom lovers.